Good evening, Sterile Processing Universe and Operating Room Universe and Infection Prevention Universe. My name is Hank Balch. Thank you for tuning in to this pre-session of Mission Control, the big conference that we've got going on tomorrow, but it actually starts right now with a great session and interview talking all things education as it relates to IP and the OR and sterile processing. We got a great panel set up for you tonight. Thank you for tuning in. If you have not registered for that free event and conference that is going on tomorrow, it's not too late. That's why we did this pre-session, so that you get one good reminder to say, hey, you don't know what you're doing for your Saturday? Well, now you do. Go to educate.beyondclean.net/superbugs2021. And that will take you to the registration page. We'll have that link in the comment section below this video as well. You can get 10 CEs if you're a sterile processing professional, or you can get 8 if you're a nurse and you're looking for those nursing contact hours. I want to give a shout out to our event sponsor, 3M Healthcare. Thank you so much for investing in education like this that's creative, fun, and engaging. And a special shout out to our collaborative host for this event, our team over at the First Case podcast. So if you're familiar with Beyond Clean, you know we're all things sterile processing, but we've actually got a sister podcast called First Case that's all things operating room. So if you're into podcasts, into education, and the type of media content that you see through Beyond Clean, go check out that team at First Case. They've got pages on Facebook. They got LinkedIn pages. As I said, they've got podcast articles on the go, all kinds of great stuff going on over there. And then to wrap all the shout outs up, I want to give a shout out to CCI, who is our partner in this education and supports us not only through the co-branding, but also through the approvals for nursing contact hours and the credits toward their own certification, the CNOR certification, and a few others. And also micro credentials, which I think is going to come up once or twice in the following interview. So without further ado, if you're tuning in live through Facebook, LinkedIn, or YouTube, we'd love to know who you are and where you're tuning in from. And if you want to tell us what role you have in this whole surgical services, healthcare space, please put that in the comment section below. And if we don't get to your comment or question during the show, we'll come in afterwards and try to give you feedback and links and resources to anything that came up in this conversation. So joining me today, I'm going to pull them in here to the studio, is Lisa McCown and Melissa Morgan. And I'm going to let each of these ladies introduce themselves to the audience, and then we're going to get into the meat and potatoes of this interview on education. So Lisa, would you kick us off and tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So I am the manager of research and development for Beyond Clean. I have a background in sterile processing, and I am working on a doctoral program in public health, and really just a subject matter expert in researching and writing for the sterile processing space related to infection prevention and medical devices.
I think they call that like a sterile processing nerd. Is that the technical term for what you are? Awesome. Thank you for joining us tonight, Lisa. And Melissa, who are you and why do you care about this topic?
Well, Hank, you know, I am the original sterile processing nerd for sure. But my name is Melissa Morgan, and I'm the Senior Director for Infection Prevention at Orlando Health. And I have been very engaged and involved with sterile processing departments for several years, starting back when I was in a healthcare system in Central North Carolina, where I learned so much about sterile processing from an amazing team. And I have been an infection preventionist since 2010. I love all things infection prevention, and I believe some of our foundational members of infection prevention are sterile processing team members. So glad to be here with you all today.
And yeah, the world of sterile processing is small, but the world of IP, I think, is even smaller. And for those of y'all who are planning on going to the conference tomorrow, you're gonna hear from someone that Melissa knows, Missy Garner.
Yes.
What's that connection? Just so folks can kind of put the pieces together.
Sure. So I had the actual opportunity and pleasure to bring Misty Garner to the Cone Health Infection Prevention team. She was assigned to one of our facilities in North Carolina. She was the primary IP there, and she and I got to explore operative services and sterile processing. She did an enormous amount of work around point of use and really worked with that team hand in hand to develop a process that worked. So I was just honored and appreciative of her energy and how much she engaged with that team. And it was just a pleasure to work with Missy.
Awesome. Well, the wires also kind of crossed into your world too, Lisa. So how do you know her, or how do you know that name at least?
Yeah, she actually was the very first infection preventionist to finish the cross-contamination micro-credential that we just launched through CCI. So, and she did just outstanding work. So
yeah,
high achiever.
It's so cool to see how all these things get connected and all these relationships build through education, through mentorship, especially. So I appreciate you both sharing that, but I want to congratulate her as well too. And if you're on the fence again about registering tomorrow, this is just another reason to get in there and then tune into her session, especially. As we get rolling here, I don't think it's going to be any surprise to anyone tuning in that it's been a crazy couple of years, shall we say, for the IP industry, particularly in healthcare, but in general. Something happened. I don't know if anyone knows this, but coronavirus, and it really threw an entire curveball to the whole healthcare system. But I know IPs in particular have carried a large portion of that weight on their shoulders. So Melissa, can you give us kind of a state of the industry today? Like, what is going on out there in the fall of 2021 that folks may not be aware of?
Well, you're probably all really aware of the infection prevention industry's actual popularity. We really rose to the top at all the healthcare organizations as a subject matter expert and someone to lean into. I think that this team historically is not staffed, probably much like many sterile processing departments are challenged with. And so the force of surge and pandemic needs has really strained those departments. And we were already at kind of a cataclysmic moment where we have a significant part of our population that is on the verge of retirement or, wanting to retire and enjoy life. And so we were already experiencing some shortages and some difficulties in recruitment. But then when you add in all of the demands for nursing and nursing shortages and the need for additional infection preventionists, it's really become a kind of a Bermuda Triangle. And I know at the organizations that I was with during the middle of COVID, and now the organization I'm with now, we continue to have recruitment challenges. We're continually having to look outside what was historically a nurse or a lab technician background to see who else brings some of that expertise to what we do. Looking at procedural areas, how do we partner with our sterile processing experts, our OR experts, to really strengthen the foothold in high-risk areas, but also think outside the box of the historical lab tech or nurse for an IP role.
That's exciting. I want to talk about that more here in a second. Well, it's exciting for an outsider. It's probably not exciting for an insider going through it. But you mentioned retirement, right, and a staffing crisis. But what you didn't mention that I'm just going to assume is burnout. Has that been something that at the industry in general has been struggling with?
Yes, I think definitely resilience has been is a definite challenge. I know for me personally, I continually have to look at what is filling my cup. I think anybody in healthcare at this point is really evaluating those needs, just because even though if you were not intimately engaged with pandemic management, it affected everybody in healthcare. I mean, the organizations that I have discussed with or colleagues that I've talked to, they talked about shutting down different service lines so that they could support patients. Places like our PACU became ICU beds. And so we use that staff differently, but some of the ancillary staff got left out. And so we saw decreases, and then we've had hospital financial struggles. And so that has all perpetuated this exhaustion amongst all our healthcare workers, but especially infection prevention, because how do we make sure we're prepared next time?
Right.
How do we keep from feeling like what I do is continual? And for the first time in my career as an infection preventionist, I didn't feel like I had the science to support me. Back in the early pandemic, guidelines and information changed every single day as we were forced. And so now there's all this, what do we do now? How do we come out of this? We've been in almost 2 years of universal masking. What does that look like going forward? Is this our forever, or how do we find an even balance? So I think a lot of the hard questions are still out there, and we have to remember to use each other as that resilience, right? Where do I get my passion? Where do I get my encouragement? Sometimes that's from my sterile processing colleagues, honestly.
Yeah, that description of this time, kind of like the Wild West. I don't think you said that, but in that early pandemic response, we definitely felt that on the sterile processing side of things too. Like we don't quite have the science here for what we're being asked to do, related to the mass reprocessing in particular, was just a huge, maybe like a watershed moment, honestly, because there was so much pressure to be the hero, but to be the hero and do something that you're not exactly sure that is the right thing to do or the best thing to do or the best way to do it. And a lot of folks, still carry that, kind of shock or that PTSD of just that, 2 years later here. And as you said, we're still in the midst of it, 2 years. Right. And so I can totally feel that. I'm just kind of curious, because of the staffing crisis that you mentioned and opening up, to get a little bit more creative on, who it is that you're bringing into that IP staff. We're going to talk about that here more in a moment too. But is there a market for travelers or interim IPs? Like, is that such a thing? And are they really utilized?
So there is a market, much like consultants. There is a large group of infection preventionists that do consult and do travel. That niche is so small that the number of openings has outpaced that group. And, the challenge is real when it comes to salaries, right? So you invest in a traveler at sometimes 3 or 4 times the amount of salary that you would pay somebody in-house. They're temporary. Would you be better off investing in a novice that has a different commitment to the organization? So those are all challenges I think we ask ourselves. And, I remember as a sterile processing leader, I had the same kind of questions, right? We all think about travelers, that's temporary staff. Their engagement with our processes, making sure that patients are really at the center is very different sometimes. And that commitment and understanding that training is different, right? Onboarding for a traveler is like, what, 2.5 minutes versus,
That's why you have them there, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Get in, get to work.
Exactly. Get out there and do what you do because you come with a credential or you come with a number of years of experience. But I think we've all been with those people and realized that there's still gaps there. If you have standard work in your department and, certain what we call bundles in infection prevention, do they know all our elements of those bundles? Can they articulate those? It's just, I equate it to like decon, right? I mean, I've been in a lot of decons in my life, and very rarely do they all do it the exact same way. But Amy's standards are pretty clear.
Right.
So, it's how do we strike that balance? How do we make sure that if we use that temporary staff, that we get them up to speed, that we continue that collaboration and mentorship? And then when do we invest in somebody who might be considered novice or not necessarily a historical group or clinicians that we would draw from for our professional basis, but are really, really good fits?
You bring up that traveler piece, and I obviously asked about the IP travelers, but then, you brought it to some place. It's actually, I want to bring Lisa in on for this, is the competence of our sterile processing travelers or operating room travelers, right? Like we get nurses and surgical techs as well, they're coming in on those assignments. And even if they are very good at their jobs, wherever their home hospital is, you're picking them up and dropping them into a new culture, a new process, like new bundles, as you mentioned. What's your perspective on that, Lisa, for where the department leader or, department educator, like how do they need to assess those folks that are coming in, for those short-term contracts, like what Melissa mentioned?
Well, I think first of all, healthcare organizations really need to be sharing their policies and their procedures with the travelers, because while they may really kind of feel that they don't need to know those things because they're, facility specific,
right?
A lot of times, especially if you have a seasoned traveler, they are going to have questions and they're going to need to know, how do you do it here? Because they want to do the right thing, so I think that's probably the first.
And that needs to be policy based, right? Because I can see it and hear it already. What happens for a lot of these travelers is they get in and they turn around and say, "Hey, Johnny, how do y'all do this here?" And Johnny's like, "Oh, this is what we do," but Johnny's not reflecting what the policy is. Johnny's reflecting what he does, which means now you got two people, not compliant to your department policy. One is a permanent and one's a traveler. And then I'm assuming those are kind of challenges that you walk into, Melissa, from the IP audit side of how did this get so out of control so quickly? And we've got this great policy over here that if everyone did it this way, it'd be perfect, right?
Right, exactly.
So I do want to go back again to that kind of IP state of the union. And this is something, again, that Melissa, that you alluded to, but I want you to specify a little bit more because it goes into where the gaps are that we're going to talk about later. In terms of staffing, how do facilities determine how many IPs they need? I remember early on in my career, I was just randomly talking to the hospital security guard, and I was like, how do y'all determine how many security guards we need, for the facility? And he was like, oh, it's by square foot. And like, we got so many square foot, and we need like so many security guards. I'm like, but that if it's not like, square foot where there's public, like that seems less valuable. Like if you got more public square foot, that's more outsiders that we need security for, and then etc. So he wasn't happy about how they calculated staffing for security guards, but I'm kind of curious, what is that metric for IPs?
So that is a little bit all over the place, honestly, Hank.
Okay.
I'll just tell you that Association of Professionals in Infection Control, SHEA, all of these things have been published. It used to be 1 IP per 100 beds, not occupied beds, not average daily census, not licensed beds, but 100 beds in your facility. That has morphed a little bit as healthcare has changed. When you start looking at units that do progressive care or settings where patients are 23-hour OBS, things like that, the complexities of the healthcare organization have changed. So there's a lot that has to do with the number of ICU beds, the level of care. If you're a level 3 trauma center versus a critical access, most people can land somewhere between 80 and 100 beds per IP as an average. I can tell you, for me, coming from, I'm on the third large health system I'm with, the thing that is difficult to capture is that ambulatory space. Hospitals are no longer a one hospital building. Many of them have associated buildings where medical procedures take place, medical towers, medical offices. They have created large collaborations of healthcare entities. And so all of those spaces require infection prevention engagement. And so, like, how do you compare, 50 practices to 80 beds? And so I think those are some things that we're still trying to manage and figure out. I think that if you get anywhere over 100 beds, the infection preventionist time is spent more at the computer than out engaging with the staff or being a part of team development and process improvement. And so you're losing that momentum and that subject matter expertise where you best need it. And so that's what I try to remember and encourage with executive leaders is, what kind of presence do you want from infection prevention? Do you need a report out, or do you want an engaged staff member helping you solve problems? Because if you want that engagement, you're going to have to put some money behind that, and we need enough people to do the work.
I love that. That's a great question to ask. Do you want engagement, or do you just want a couple people in the computer room, typing
out
up
numbers, right? Yeah. Like, you've got a CLABSI, you've got a CALDI, right. Or do you want me at the bedside saying, do you have a Foley? Why does this patient have a Foley? What can we do? What alternatives do we have? So that changes the mindset a little bit.
Yeah, it's the proactive versus reactive. Do you want us to actually be able to catch these things before they happen, or just tell you how many that happened?
Exactly. And that's really where the IP is better serving the facility, right? I mean, I didn't get into this to sit behind a computer. And, I appreciate the opportunity today to sit behind my camera and talk to you guys. But honestly, I'm here so I can be engaging with the staff and say, what barriers exist and how do I lift them for you? Because otherwise, I'm not really here to help the patient. And that's why I get up every morning. That's why the pandemic didn't take me out. That's why I keep coming back to work every day.
And so I know there's going to be a diverse audience that's tuning into this, right? So we're going to have sterile processing folks, going to have operating room folks, going to have supply chain folks. We'll probably have a couple of surgeons, C-suite. But I know from the sterile processing technician, and even like as a manager, I wasn't really aware of all of the scope of support that my IP team was required to be a part of. Like I would see them in our areas and I would be like, hey, like, did you follow up on this? You got to answer for that, or can you help me with this? But kind of paint that scope. Like how many departments are we talking about? Like what is the expectation for expertise for all of those departments? And then we can kind of drill down and, past that, but just kind of put that initial thumbnail, like how big of a project do these IPs have to get their arms around?
So really, when you think about an infection preventionist scope of practice, I actually had a Joint Commission surveyor tell me one time during survey that anything that had the name of my facility on it was my scope of practice.
Okay.
So, that's a little daunting as you think about it. But I like to say it goes from the plumbing under the building to the roof, from end to end, and any person who enters the facility. So all of those people are affected by our infection prevention measures, right? And so we have an infection prevention plan that we're all responsible for. Every single person in the healthcare system is responsible for, but the onus on ensuring that it's in practice is on that infection prevention team. So that's really the scope. So sometimes that means dressed out watching a surgery. Sometimes that means climbing into a ceiling with a facilities team to understand what that looks like, walking a construction site.
That's a good description. That's what I've seen my IPs doing.
Or sweeping the floor if that's what needs to be done. It's really a jack of all trades that we have to know a little bit about. And that's why we need so many partners in these specialty areas, because I bring my infection prevention lens or glasses, so to speak. But, I do know what it's like to be in decon for a bunch of hours. But not everybody has that experience, right? Not every infection preventionist has been in the OR assisting a case or watching a case or walking with the facility guys as he checks for penetrations and looks for risk or leaks, those kind of things. So it's really all these partners that we must have to make our scope even something we can do.
Right. So Lisa, on the sterile processing perspective, like as an educator and a quality assurance manager, like those kinds of roles, I would assume would be the kinds of roles that an IP would love to befriend in a facility setting. So how would you recommend a sterile processing user themselves, like number one, prepare themselves to be a good advocate and resource for their IP team, but number two, actually make that connection and build that relationship?
Yeah, because just like Melissa was explaining, just with how many departments and units and offices that IPs need to integrate with, a lot of times they have an opportunity to kind of just touch and skim over, the high level in each of these areas, but not necessarily do the deep dive that they want to. So in sterile processing, some of the areas that they really could use a partner for would be in understanding specific, especially complex medical devices and like the processes that are involved with those devices. So understanding more about decontamination, sterilization, high-level disinfection, knowing about the equipment and the chemicals and things like that, like the workflow. Then understanding the challenges that exist with manufacturers' IFUs, understanding the voluntary industry standards and guidelines, because a lot of times they may or may not know even what AMI is or what, I'm sure they would know what AORN is, but and some of the others, but they might
especially if they're new, right? Yeah.
Right. And they might not know necessarily which publication is the one to reference and so forth. And so also what specific accreditation bodies are looking for in the sterile processing space. So, or surveyors from other organizations. Also, like the latest hot topics in the medical device industry space. I think a couple of them that just are top of mind for me are certain FDA updates, or like the urology scope, recent infections that have been going around,
Right.
and then like the disposable ERCP duodenoscopes that came out, just a little while ago. So sometimes IPs wouldn't necessarily be up to speed on those things. And so a partner like a education quality coordinator, or, a supervisor or a manager in sterile processing can help kind of link those things together. And then, they can collaborate with each other to both educate the OR and also the technicians who are performing the work.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And as our resident IP on this panel, Melissa, I'm just going to ask you like a representative question for the industry. In general, IPs would not be offended if a sterile processing, honestly, like any role, I didn't even have to be a leader, like technician or anybody, would send these kinds of updates that Lisa's referencing. And hey, like I just saw this update came out of Amy, or just saw this release from FDA. If that shows up in your email box, you're not going to be like, oh, that's my job. Let me try to find those kind of things. Like, you're going to be like, okay, thanks. Right?
I'm going to be like, oh, great. Now, can you tell me what that means for us? Because especially with the pandemic, the distraction is there. We can, just like anything else, we can get in our lane, and in infection prevention, it's a little bit like whack-a-mole. I fix this problem and then another one pops up. And so, anytime I have that partner to keep me engaged, involved, to know, this has changed, our policies capture it, no big deal. It's not like I'm having to search or beg or look for that information. I would be extremely grateful for a partner like that every day, because I need to know that those people have my back, because I definitely have theirs.
Right. Now, Lisa mentioned a handful of kind of those deeper dive issues in sterile processing that could be challenging for IPs, especially new IPs. Are there any others on the sterile processing side that, like, you've experienced as definitely a challenge in the IP space, and just kind of knowledge or comfort level with? And then the same question kind of for the OR side, like, what are those things that are just always causing headaches for IPs in the OR?
Well, you can look at the top findings from the Joint Commission and always know that ends up being
You're right.
a lot of
I wonder why.
infection prevention, mostly because those standards cross into the IC world. Actually had a surveyor last week tell me, it's a little chapter, but it sure does pack a punch. Well, you're right, it does. And it gets a lot of attention fast. And it's so specialized, right? Like, Dr. So-and-so's specific instrument, that's very special and that's very unique. And you have to know the IFUs, you have to know whether or not, if he drops it, can I flash it? There's so much intricacy in that. And so as an IP, if I've never worked in that space, or my experience is only to visit for an audit tool that somebody gave me, right, understanding the impact of those risks that exist there are extremely difficult. And when you look at what education is out there, sometimes it's hard to find sterile processing education. I was so excited to hear about one of your speakers at the conference because I had the pleasure of working with her in North Carolina and remembered when she went for her first sterile processing certification. And actually many of the team, the infection prevention team, as well as myself, did that. And we kind of had to dig and beg for that, you know, because it's really not, it's so specialized to sterile processing that, you know, you have to kind of be sponsored and spend time in sterile processing. Whereas really the mechanics and the information is really kind of integrated into infection control and infection prevention, where if we could make that pathway just a little bit easier, I think the body of infection prevention could get a lot smarter and we could just partner in so many more important ways. You know, there are offerings. APIC, Association of Professionals in Infection Control, offers some sterilization and disinfection, but it's nothing like what you learn when you're in your facility, right? Because there's Amy, the big Amy, right? And then there's AORN, and then there's that work that occurs. And so not only do you need those big view pictures, but you really need to be in that department understanding, you know, why do you do this? Why do you do that? You understand the big mechanic of sterilization, but what goes into sterilization is so much more complicated than turning on a machine. And so having those partners is so important.
Yeah, and that's a huge topic of conversation, honestly, for Beyond Clean and First Case, because we're all about education.
Right.
Not only for users in our departments, you know, but for this collaborative IP conversation. And so, yeah, you touched on a lot there, and I want to go to maybe one of that, you know, maybe it was like a side comment that you made, but it really got my mind racing of how sterile processing and operating room teams could better educate IPs in-house. And so, Lisa, I'm going to kind of throw this to you, you know, for your insight. We kind of alluded to, you know, some of these groups out there that do education. We'll talk a little bit about the groups that do certification and such, you know, but Melissa made a great point. Some of the most valuable education just happens right in the department at the point of work, you know, with the clinicians that you're actually supporting in your role as an IP. What can sterile processing and OR teams do education-wise to better partner and provide that like hands-on education, you know, for the IP teams that support us?
So typically IPs are already in the department doing a tracer, using maybe a Joint Commission audit tool or something like that. But I think that Melissa brought up a really great point in that, you know, she has experience working in decontam and, you know, some of these other more critical spaces, you know, maybe processing a scope, you know, maybe if they had a chance to kind of shadow
actually do it.
Yeah, you might see what those pain points were, and then, you know, be part of that problem solving, you know, brainstorm part of the process. So, because I think a lot of times departments, the leadership doesn't necessarily want, you know, they want to give the impression that everything is going well, you know?
Bingo. Yeah.
And so if an IP has a chance to get in there and actually see it for themselves, then they can raise their concerns and get the kind of support that's necessary to really fix something.
So, question back to Melissa as the token IP here. Is IP on your side? Are they not on your side as a sterile processing or OR person? Like, are y'all on our team? Are you on like the C-suite's team or the Joint Commission's team, right? Like, how should we view your role?
So Melissa Morgan is on your side.
Okay.
And I can tell you that many of the infection preventionists that I work with, we are on the side of sterile processing. We're on the side of the clinician. Many of us don't have enough information. And so all we know to do is really point out from an audit tool what could be wrong or what's not. If we could partner in a way where you say, okay, I appreciate, from a leadership standpoint, I appreciate that you have found these findings, but could you come to our in-service with X vendor tomorrow? Because I really want you to understand the challenges of this piece of equipment. Maybe it would help us as we work through X, Y, and Z. Bring us into that. Many of these specialty areas have continued education all the time. They do skills fairs for the OR. They do observation periods. Internally, we do competency reviews. All those are excellent times to be able to partner with your sterile processing and your infection preventionists to say, we know that our goal is to do it right. We know we probably have opportunities because healthcare changes every day. So I want to teach you so you can help me in those opportunities. And I think that builds a relationship differently than we see in other ways. I hate the word audit. I hate the word audit because if I got an audit, I would be sideways about it, right? Mm-hmm. And so when I'm an infection preventionist, I'm doing an observation. So I'm doing an observation. This is our policy. This is what you do. It's an observation. Now help me understand where we can't do the policy or where this IFU makes it difficult to do this policy, or we just don't even have the equipment to do what you're asking me to do, Melissa. All of those are a totally different conversation than Melissa came and audited my department today. Right. And so I think that if sterile processing can welcome us and not run from us, even if we are scary, that's a start, right? And then just starting those conversations, like, thanks for coming today. You want me to show you what I do? Let me show you how I do this. Just that humbleness would get us so much further along. And we know how important we are to each other.
I think it's a big practical takeaway that I want to highlight from what you just said is invite your IPs to your continuing education opportunities. And between the OR and sterile processing, there's probably multiples of those happening every day between the shifts, at the staff meetings, at the daily huddles. And, obviously, as we've discussed, IPs being pulled a million directions, so they're not going to be able to go to every one, but at least make them aware, especially of those issues and situations that Lisa kind of described that we know are the challenges. Like we know high-level disinfection is a risk, and so we want to pull them in anytime we get the vendor coming in, anytime we're doing a staff in service, so that there's just that opportunity to, in a lower stress setting than an observation or an audit, they're just there to learn with us. Right. Ask some questions, like kind of meet face to face. You're right. It can be scary if this is the first time that you've ever seen this person with a clipboard in your decontamination room, and you're like, oh man, I've only been here 3 months. Please have mercy. Right. But to build those personal relationships too, that was a big part of that question.
And I think at that education session, that's about relationship building, right? It's not you versus me. It's not you watching me. We're here to learn together. And as adults, we would ask good questions that would stimulate each other to really think about that process. So, what a really non-intense situation to bring your IP into. Right.
That's a great point. As we start kind of moving toward a close, we got a couple more minutes here. I do want to talk about kind of that certification, micro-credential education piece of things. And Lisa, because we've alluded to at the beginning of this interview, there's a new micro-credential out there that's already being used by sterile processing, OR, and IP professionals to deepen their knowledge around cross-contamination. Can you talk about that and give a little bit of insight into how folks can get involved in that program.
Yeah. So it's really a deep dive into understanding cross-contamination, really from the microbiological standpoint, but also from a person's ability to raise their awareness on their own work practices and to connect the dots between all of the pieces and parts that go into that picture for their workflow, and help them to apply critical thinking skills that they can use in the real world work setting. So it's to elevate their competence and provide them with a marketable skill that's deeply needed in this industry.
It's available to any healthcare professional, right? No prerequisite that you have to be in sterile processing or the OR, that you got to be a nurse. Okay, great. And if anyone would like some more information about that program in particular, you can go to beyondclean.net/microcredential, or you can track it down through the CCI website as well. And then just click on the tab that says microcredential. And they've got a couple of different microcredentials there. On the certification side of things, Melissa, you alluded to the fact that some IPs, many IPs, maybe get the sterile processing certification as a part of their kind of dive into the sterile processing world. There's also a CIC certification, right? Can you speak to what that is and like what role that plays?
So there is a certification in infection control and epidemiology offered by the CIBIC board, Certification Board of Infection Control and Epidemiologists, right? So let's not make it too complicated. Right. But that is a certification that historically was only reserved for infection preventionists who had worked in the field for at least 2 years. So very much like a lot of the sterile processing, where you have to have so many hours in the field, because a lot of infection prevention can be, you can read about 50% of it, but 50% of it is usually about experience and exposure to different elements of the world. But now they have released it from that kind of requirement. So really anyone who has a health sciences background can take the CIC certification. I will tell you that it was one of the hardest tests I have ever taken.
That's what I've heard.
It is graded on one of those interesting bell curves where there will be people who do not pass, right, and people who do, but they've also come out with an association certification that is not quite at the level of an infection preventionist, that may be of interest to others who are very interested in pursuing this career but maybe don't feel like they have the historical degreed background, but would at least introduce them to the career and understand some of the concepts. And many of us are looking at, any of those folks who have that, what I think it's called AIPC, to see, what can we use those folks for in our departments. So lots of opportunity. Go to the Association of Professionals in Infection Control or the civic.org website to obtain a lot of information about those.
And we'll try to put some of those links too below the video for folks to check out. Yeah, that's great to hear about. It's open, but it's definitely a difficult test for the CIC, which makes sense because we're doing a complex, very important role in the healthcare space. So yeah, we don't want that to be something that's easy to pass necessarily. We completely ran out of time. Well, not necessarily ran out of time. I think we covered most of what we want to cover, but the time went quickly, ladies. I want to thank you both for not only your time tonight, but your investment and commitment to the industry, because both of y'all are doing tremendous work in this space, and you're leaving a legacy behind you right now, as we speak, you're building mentorship relationships, you're building credentials, and you're doing fun things like this, which is sharing insight and knowledge to encourage the whole industry to collaborate better around these challenges. So thank each of you for your time tonight.
And Hank, thank you, because it is podcasts like this that are really helping all of us to be more educated and collaborate better. So thank you for what you and your team are doing.
Awesome. Thank you. Well, we'll end on that high note. So if you're tuning in, folks, and you haven't registered, as a reminder, go to educate.beyondclean.net/superbugs2021 to register for the rest of the conference tomorrow. And until next time, keep fighting dirty.